Hello and welcome everyone to the TLMI printTHINK webinar. This year, TLMI's webinar series focuses in on automation, and I think we have a really interesting discussion today. Our conversation is going to be about the role of planning and scheduling in the Industry 4.0 revolution. I'm Keith Graham, I'm Vice President of Label Tracks and also a member of the TLMI Technical Committee. So some housekeeping issues before we get started. All of the questions that you have, please direct them to the question section in the control panel, and we'll make sure to answer those typically at the end of the webinar. If we don't get to your question at the end, we will make sure to get back to you via email to make sure and respond to you. So everyone will get a response back to any question that you've submitted. Also, the webinar will be recorded and hosted on the TLMI website. So at this point, let me just talk a little bit about where we're going to go today. So when I first got into this industry, if you would have told me that you could, do some automation in the scheduling part of your business, I would have laughed. It would have been kind of like, oh, be careful what you wish for. And today we're going to talk about some technology and things that you can do to really take a look at, can you automate it, and is this something you want to do? So again, it's something that I think is very important, but the things you have to consider are, how is it you want to handle the technology? How is it you're handling your business? And kind of what are the things that you need to think about as you move forward? So at this point, I'd like to introduce our guest, Matt Murphy. He's CEO of Batched. So Matt, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Keith, for the introduction, and thanks to the TLMI folks for having me on for today's discussion. I'm looking forward to the topic and should be fun. So as Keith mentioned, my name is Matt Murphy. Nice to meet all of you virtually. If you hear a little bit of downness in my voice today, it's because I'm born and raised in Cincinnati, so we're still all grieving here from the Super Bowl outcome on Sunday. So we're all going through the different stages of grief, and I think I'm getting close to the end, but I'm not quite there yet. So we're getting close. My background, I'm actually come from a consulting background personally. Spent a lot of different years working in a variety of different manufacturing industries, and was exposed really to the label, print, and packaging industry about 5 years ago in a consultative fashion, and have since spent quite a bit of time working in a variety of different label manufacturing environments, and was fortunate enough to get involved in the batch product and start to bring the product to market relative to planning and scheduling. So that's a little bit about my background. In terms of this specific topic for today, as Keith mentioned, really what we want to talk about is how does this idea of planning and scheduling and automation of planning and scheduling and kind of automation in general fit in this broader trend or macroeconomic trend that's going around called Industry 4.0, which many of you on the call have probably seen that term ad nauseum in variety of different advertising or publications or buzzwordy. It's very buzzwordy type term. Okay, so what we want to do today is spend a little bit of time talking about what that really means in practice, and then what that really means specifically to planning and scheduling, and share a little bit about how we're approaching those opportunities and those challenge statements. What we want you as the audience to get out of today is hopefully just a little bit of knowledge sharing around what this Industry 4.0 thing really is, how it's affecting label manufacturers, and then again, the opportunities and the challenge statements around planning and scheduling in particular. And lastly, we really hope that you leave today with at least a few tangible things, next steps, ideas, even research opportunities that you can take as a next step to start learning more. So that's what we're bringing to the table today and what we want to walk through. As Keith mentioned, please feel free to submit Q&A during the presentation, as well as we'll have some time at the end. Keith will be monitoring the Q&A section of it. So if your question comes up and doesn't get addressed during the presentation, we'll certainly get it covered at the end. Perfect. So with that, I'll jump into the actual content. So let's just start with as simple as we can, definition of what Industry 4.0 actually is. So you can see, the definition that we use. It's a pretty common one that IBM has put out there. But really, if you pick apart what this statement means, it's using new technologies to deliver real-time decision-making, enhance productivity, flexibility, agility in the manufacturing process. And so if you've heard that term in a bunch of different fashions, that's about as simple as we can make it. Okay, so obviously in our personal world, there's a new technology coming out about every week, whether that's iPhone related or some other technology or personal or consumer good related. A lot of that technology are now seeping and blending into the manufacturing environment as well, and focused on things like real-time decision making, productivity, flexibility, agility. So as we talk about Industry 4.0, keep those terms in mind as to what it really means, and it shouldn't be any more complicated than that. Okay. From a background perspective, let's talk about, we're on Industry 4.0, so what were the first three, just to provide a little bit of historical context. So if you go back, way back when, to what we call Industry 1.0, that's really the first time that you were starting to see mechanization going on in the manufacturing process. That's really the shift from what we'll call, human-centric, artisanal type manufacturing processes to using things like steam power, the weaving loom, things like that, that take what were very one-off type manufacturing or person-centric manufacturing processes and moving towards more mechanized processes. Industry 2.0, that's what a lot of folks remember, because that's the first introduction of things like the assembly line starting to use that mechanized power for mass assembly and mass production. And then more recently, starting in kind of the 1960s, 1970s, you start to get into what's been termed as Industry 3.0, which is more focused on things like automation and of certain manufacturing activities, low skill, low complexity type manufacturing activities, as well as starting to digitize different pieces of the manufacturing process. So think about, right around that time, 70s and 80s, that's where you start to get introduced into ERP, MIS type systems that are working on just simply providing a digitized mechanism to capture all of this information relative to the manufacturing process, okay? And then as you can see, the time periods between each of these are shrinking, right? So you go from 1700s to 1800s to 1960s to now we're only, half a century after that, we're already into what is being called the Industry 4.0, which is really, again, going back to our definition before, utilizing this technological revolution that's going on in this widely available new technologies to really change how we're making decisions in real time and allowing us to be more productive, more flexible, more agile in the manufacturing process. So a lot of other things you'll start to hear are like the Internet of Things. So all these devices on the shop floor that are interconnected with each other. Things like, cyber physical systems. That if you're a fan of the Matrix, you probably think of things like the Matrix right off the bat, where it's the blending of the physical world and the digital world. But what that really means when we talk about manufacturers is you still have people and things doing physical activities out there on the shop floor. You have physical products that are being made in most cases, but many of those physical activities, physical products can now be driven by cyber systems, whether that's an ERP system, an MIS system, a planning and scheduling system. It's using those technology advancements to influence and blend into those physical environments. That's what we really mean when we talk about cyber physical examples here. So if we specialize that and get away from these general like historical context terms to what does this mean in the actual label printing industry, if we were to draw some analogies, the first flexo printing press type piece of equipment that came out back in the early 1900s, you can see here we were starting to mechanize the process, starting to add some mass production type capabilities into it. As we go from there to Industry 3.0, that's where you start to see things like, I always use the example of a palletizer. So what used to be a low skill, low complexity task of, taking these boxes and putting it on a pallet, stacking them, and then shrink wrapping them and moving it down a conveyor, a lot of times you can go out and get, a piece of equipment that does that for you. So you're automating that task out of the manufacturing environment. That's where you also start to get to the introduction of these digital systems, these MIS systems, ERP systems, starting to capture and track data at a granular level, but also being able to monitor things like trends over time. As we go to things that would classify into this Industry 4.0 category, that's where we get to things like vision systems, right? So some of you on the call are probably familiar or even have implemented quality vision systems on the floor that can actually look for defects in real time. And based on the artwork that's been approved by the customer, you can determine, is there a defect on this particular roll of material as it's going through the shop, or An example that we see quite often is using things like encoder wheels on your actual assets to gather real-time data off the floor as to what your speeds are and how much footage is being run and what's the status of the machines, and starting to blend those physical assets into more of a digital world. Another example, we threw the idea down here of a slitter, where some of these now have the capability to auto adjust where the slitters are on the machine based on the specs of the artwork and the job that's being produced. What you can see here is you're starting to see this physical world blending into the digital world and allowing these really physical activities to be dictated by the systems that are driving them. Okay, and so those are some examples of what we're starting to see bleed into this particular industry that would classify, again, in this big buzzword called Industry 4.0, but really you can see some very tangible examples here of what that can mean in your business. Okay, so some of the common opportunities that we see out there from an Industry 4.0 perspective, and we'll start to hit these as they relate to planning and scheduling. One of the big items that we see very often is, if you look at some of those examples that we just talked through, many of those are focused on the physical manufacturing process, okay? And a lot of the equipment manufacturers, as an example, are constantly working on innovating their machines to be faster, more reliable, higher quality outputs, more integrated with an ERP or an MIS type system, removing manual tasks or repetitive tasks from what the operators need to do on the floor. So there has been all sorts of innovation in the manufacturing space, specifically this industry, as it comes to the equipment that is actually being used to produce these products. An example, like we just mentioned, a slitter that can automatically adjust where the blades are given the specs of the artwork or the products that need to be produced. Can be a huge time saver for the operators and for the manufacturers out there on the shop floor. But not oftentimes is the same amount of attention from an Industry 4.0 perspective being placed on all of the processes that drive those pieces of equipment, okay? So planning and scheduling is one of those prime examples that we talk through quite a bit, where even with all of this innovation that's occurring from an equipment manufacturing perspective, there still are all sorts of opportunities to introduce those same type of systems into your other decision-making processes throughout the organization. Okay, so one of the items that we focused on very heavily is, we call it autonomous decision-making processes. Okay, so those parts of your business that have lots of decisions being made, very repetitive decisions being made, that a computer or a system or a technology could be capable of making those decisions. Okay, so one thing I would consider all of you on the call to think about is, where in your business do you have repetitive decision making, repetitive processes, repetitive schools of thought being executed on a day-to-day basis? That is a very ripe opportunity to think about using a technology or an element of this Industry 4.0 revolution to automate or to enhance those processes. Okay, and the goal of this is not to replace humans. It's not to remove the need for humans to be a part of the decision-making process. The goal is to really raise the bar for what requires a human involvement to make a decision. Okay, and we get a lot of questions in the planning and scheduling space of, well, if I implement this system, is this just going to remove the need for a planner or a scheduler in the organization? And the answer is, heck no. Especially in today's environment, it's hard enough to find really good people, especially people who know the industry and have experience. But what you don't want to have happen is that person spending all of their day on a series of processes or decisions that we have all of the data and information for, and the technology to help them make those decisions more quickly, more reliably. So that way those folks are really spending their time solving exceptions or managing problems or managing the process versus executing the process. Okay, so this is really, again, just to summarize this, is we have all this innovation going on in the equipment side of things and the hard pieces of and assets of the manufacturing process, but we also need to look at our more human-driven processes and really start to raise the bar for what requires a person to make that actual decision, or is this something that we can allow a piece of technology to make the decision for us? Second big opportunity is looking at your assets and being able to monitor them in real time, okay? Again, either through ERP, MIS, other systems that are out there, is moving from retrospective reports, KPIs only, to really being able to see, am I ahead, am I on track, am I behind, am I late on something from a production perspective? What is the current status of those machines at any point in time so that we can quickly adapt, react, and then resolve whatever those issues are accordingly before, you know, we get to the end of the day and it's too late to make a difference. Okay. Next thing here, this is probably no shock to anybody on the call, but if you think about that industry 2.0, 3.0 distinction before, that was really focused on mass production, okay? So I'm going to go make 10 million Coke labels today that are the same thing, and that's all I'm making, okay? You know, that has complexity to it, no doubt, but the example I always give is at some point in the last 10 years when Coke decided I'm now going to put, you know, Keith's name on a bottle and Matt's name on a bottle and all of these different variations, now all of a sudden we have a customer requirement that's requiring us to be more agile and nimble in that production process than we may have needed to be historically. It's a huge challenge. It's also a huge opportunity in the sense that those that can do that right have an opportunity to really capture the attention of the customer and to be very responsive and service oriented to their customer, so that, you know, being able to deliver what the customer needs when they need it with quality, on time, efficiently. That's kind of the holy, you know, the holy grail of manufacturing if you can achieve it. And with the new technology that's coming out, it's becoming more and more realistic to achieve that. Visibility of production processes, obviously that kind of goes hand in hand with monitoring assets and processes in real time. But if you think about it, you know, most folks don't have the time in the day to be constantly babysitting what's going on in their manufacturing environment. So the more that visibility that can be provided, the more we can manage the exceptions rather than managing each job individually or each machine individually. Okay, so where does planning and scheduling start to fit in this industry 4.0 topic? Okay, and why should you care about it? I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir in most cases for those on the call today, but the way that we describe it is, you know, scheduling and planning is, in these manufacturing organizations, the heartbeat of the organization. It is central to not only how satisfied the customer is, and, you know, our ability to meet the delivery requirements or the shipping requirements of our customers, but it's also central to how efficiently we run. What's our asset uptime, our utilization, our OEE, our quality out on the shop floor, revenue and profit generation, resource all, you know, it's the heartbeat of the organization, and how we plan and how we schedule our work ultimately dictates how efficient our machines can be that we're investing so much money and innovation into. Okay, and so scheduling and planning is one of those items that you know, we identified several years ago that was really, you know, lacking in its capability to keep up with the innovation that was occurring, you know, in the equipment side of things. And just to share one quick anecdote, you know, we had a customer a couple years ago came to us and said, hey, you know, we're growing really fast, we're investing in all these new pieces of equipment, you know, the run speeds of the equipment have tripled or quadrupled from what they were several years ago, the quality capabilities are that much better than what they were 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago, but we're still drowning. And the reason, as we really started to root cause what the reason of that was, is that, you know, the equipment capabilities meant they could do, you know, maybe they were doing 50 jobs a day before, to now they had the capacity to do 150 or 200 or 250 jobs before, but they didn't have a way to effectively plan and schedule and then ultimately execute all of that work. Okay, and again, how well your machines ultimately run and how well you ultimately deliver to your customer is ultimately, in large part, a function of how you ultimately plan and schedule your work. Okay, so how does it currently work today? And we'll talk about, you know, the opportunities therein. But for most folks, it's a very complicated process. As Keith mentioned in his intro here, it's you know, 5, 10, 15 years ago, saying you could go in and automate that process entirely would be very scary, because it is a very complicated process. Okay, and so it's difficult. It's hard to do. It's complicated. It's time intensive. You know, most folks are typically doing it in a spreadsheet, or you might be doing it in their MIS system or ERP system, but usually at the end of the day, because it's so complicated, that there's someone who is doing the scheduling function in an organization, and it's error prone, it's time intensive. I always, kind of make the joke that we have these multi-million-dollar assets that we're investing in, but ultimately there's someone in the organization who's deciding what those assets do, regardless of whether or not they know all the jobs that need to be done or what the true capabilities are of that piece of equipment. And so it's just a very difficult process, and it's usually very customer oriented. So we're missing deadlines, and that just leads to a lot of fires that are constantly, coming around and on a day-to-day need to be solved. So even though in theory it should be relatively simple, right? We have all these people doing work, we've got, orders coming in, scheduling and getting them out the door, but a lot of times it ends up being super chaotic and everybody running around with their hair on fire. And so especially, this planning and scheduling function in 2021 and in the COVID era has been exacerbated by the fact that material issues, what if we could used to be able to get something in 2 days and now it's 2 months, that can greatly change how you have to plan and schedule. Labor issues, you see it on the news all the time. People aren't, good people, reliable people are not, just hanging off trees waiting for work right now. So becomes more about how do we take this this constant firefighting and put some order and some process around it. And that's usually a ripe opportunity for some type of technology solution to step in. Okay. So hard problem to solve. We talked about this a lot before, so I'll skip through this slide relatively quickly. But all of you, I'm sure, resonate with at least one bullet point up here on the slide where, essentially in the last 5 to 10 years, we've gone from, lower number of product SKUs, relatively stable material lead times, relatively stable customer expectations. So all of a sudden, we now have shorter lead time expectations from customers, mass customization, SKU proliferation, and material and labor constraints abound. Okay, so it's a huge opportunity to get it right, but it also, if you're sitting there thinking, wow, this, we've tried this before, it's a really difficult problem to tackle. It is a really difficult problem to tackle, but the good news for a lot of you is that there's, every day there's new and better technology coming out to help solve these types of problems. So as we talk about your organization, some of this may resonate with you. So what does it look like in Industry 3.0? This is typically what the current state looks like. People get a standard floating or preferential lead time based on some assumed amount of capacity in the shop. We typically will create schedules manually at some type of set increment, weekly, daily, per shift, something like that. We change it all the time. So we have rush orders come in and then we rearrange everything to try and accommodate for that. Most of it manually recorded either in your MIS, hopefully if it's in your MIS at least, or in many cases, it's on paper, a whiteboard, an Excel spreadsheet, a Google sheet, a PDF, somewhere it's being captured. And not a whole lot of visibility either upstream or downstream. And it's certainly not to the executive level or ultimately to the customer. The visibility is very limited. Okay. So I didn't give much of an introduction on batched, but I'll use this time to just share, our background and how we are approaching this problem. And hopefully, again, this can just give you a few nuggets to think about in your own business. So batched is a planning and scheduling extension for for label tracks. Excuse me. So batched is a planning and scheduling extension. It's a piece of technology that sits directly on top of label tracks in this particular case. And how we really approach the problem is, we need to be able to automate what we can, but we still need to provide flexibility to accommodate for those one-off situations. Okay. And to be honest, if you go into this problem statement just saying we want to automate the whole process, it's going to be, in a lot of cases, too daunting. Okay. So what we tried to set out to do from a batch perspective is not try and solve for every problem that could ever possibly exist from a planning and scheduling perspective, but really try to automate as much as we can, get to the 90% mark, the 95% mark, and then provide flexibility so that for those 5 to 10% of situations that don't fit neatly into an optimization problem or an automation problem, that you can then give the human the ability to manage those exceptions. Okay. So an easy example of that is rather than, a scheduler or planner needing to schedule 100 jobs every day, let batch schedule 100, all 100 for you, and then maybe make adjustments to 5 or 10 of those versus having to literally schedule 100 tickets or 100 jobs across every single asset you have. Raise the bar for human decision making. That's what we talked about before. People are in short supply, good people are even shorter supply. You have, ideally in most cases, your MIS or your ERP system is already capturing 99% of the data that you need to know where these jobs have to run. Just let the humans manage the exceptions versus having to just simply sit there and execute the process. Create transparency between front office, production, and the customer. We had one of our very first printers we started working with. They called their scheduler's office the black hole, because that's where once a ticket went into that office, until it got shipped, you had no idea what was going on with it. And that was something, as we started to really approach this problem, we wanted to tackle. We wanted to create transparency and visibility so that if there is a problem or if there is an issue, that it's addressed as quickly as possible and made visible to everybody in the organization to problem solve, as opposed to just letting it sit as a problem or stay as a problem, and then ultimately it ends up affecting either our internal efficiencies and cost numbers, or in worst case scenario, it affects our relationship with the customer. Okay, so I'm going to take a few minutes here and just show you a couple of the ways that within Batched in particular, obviously we won't do like a product demo or anything today, but just a few snippets to show you some of the ways that we're approaching it. And again, hopefully that sparks a few ideas within your own organization of ways that you could start to tackle this problem as well. All right, can everybody see my screen still?
Still can.
Awesome. So I'm just going to show a couple of things that hopefully will resonate with the points that we were just talking about, and we'll spend maybe 5 minutes or so on this, then we'll hop back up, back to the presentation, finish that out, and then open it up for Q&A. Okay, so along the theme of visibility, one of the pieces we really tried to tackle within Batched is, we talk about planning and scheduling. Okay, so planning should really be done before you ever get to the point of scheduling all of your work. Okay, and most folks really use the idea of a plan and a schedule interchangeably. And I know it might seem nuanced, but they really are different, different topics. A plan is more general. It's, what stuff do I have to do? When do I need to do it by? How long do I have to do it? Things like that. What assets are required to do it? And how well we plan has a direct influence on how effective our scheduling ultimately becomes. And the easy example that I'll give is if you have, if you're 10 days backlogged on a particular asset, if the customer's calling up and saying, hey, I need this in 7 days, you have a problem, because you can still tell the customer 7 days, but 7 days from now, you're going to have a problem, right? Because you can't schedule your way out of that situation. So one of the ways, to think about in your own organization is how can you best drive visibility into your demand and capacity in your shop at any point in time in real time, so that way you can make more accurate commitments to your customers and ultimately drive your own internal teams to better align, staffing and material availability to where the demand really is. Okay, so this quick example that I'll give within Batched, this is what we call this is the capacity planning. Some of the reporting that sits on top of all the capacity planning sections of Batched is, the ability to go in and let's just choose, a couple different types of pieces of equipment. So a flexo press, and a set of rewinders. And the example here that I'll give is we can very quickly see, no one had to do anything. No one had to analyze any data. We just have our system sitting directly on top of this to show you what's your lead time across not just your presses, but all of your assets in the shop, and that can be really, really powerful. So if you think about this, we're 15 days out on this particular piece of equipment or group of piece of equipment. So that can drive very quickly, instead of, your team spending time figuring out how busy they are, all of a sudden the problem statement becomes, how do we shrink this lead time, or how do we appropriately set expectations with customers around that lead time? Okay, so I can see very quickly on this particular asset, here's my demand and capacity outlook over the next, in this case, 30 days. So here on the 28th, I'm going to be 11 hours in the hole. Okay, so I know now, sitting here on the 15th of February, 13 days from now, 2 weeks from now, I'm going to have an issue on this particular asset. That is enough forward looking that you can start taking action on that now versus getting to the 28th and then realizing you're going to be late on different tickets or different customer expectations. Okay, so that's one element I wanted to show real briefly, and just think about that as, how are you making those commitments to your customers today, and how are you going through those planning processes? How can we better utilize our data to give ourselves more visibility into what that looks like? Okay. The next piece that I'll show you real quick gets more into the nuts and bolts of actual scheduling. So I'm just going to flash up here real quickly a machine schedule. And as Keith mentioned, part of the topic of today is automation, right? And so from a batch perspective, we really focused on automating as much of this as we can, but again, still allowing for a good amount of human input into the process, okay? So this is an example of this is a digital press, this is an HP, just as an example, where this is the schedule, right? So in the background, the MIS is collecting all of this order information for you. You're submitting orders, electronically or manually. Your planner and scheduler in this case can manage things like machine availability and uptime and downtime events and what changeovers and constraints exist. And then ultimately, there's technology, batch being one of those examples, that can take all that information and give back to you. Here is the best schedule for how you can run your shop. Okay. So, in this particular case, it's a press schedule, but you also have all your other machines and their various schedules. And this is what can actually go sit out in front of the operators on the shop floor. So it doesn't need to be a printout that's, out of date 10 minutes later, or, hey, the scheduler generated the schedule at 6 a.m., but by 11 a.m., 20 more orders have come in that completely changed how that, that schedule looks. This you can utilize technology to be much more dynamic in how you schedule, and also providing you with, here is the optimal schedule. Okay, the optimal schedule meaning it helps us get everything done on time for our customers, but also helps us run the machines efficiently and avoid unnecessary downtime where we can. Okay, so an example of that would be, in this case, we might schedule a job that's due on the 18th after jobs that are due on the 21st. Because we can capture changeover time savings by running these together up above. Okay, and then the last piece I'll show for today, tying this all together, and again, really harping on the theme of visibility, leveraging technology to automate processes, but also provide visibility across the organization. The last piece that I'll show today, just as an example, is, we call this the order status report. Okay, so this is, if you have 166 jobs that you need to ship in the next month, how many of those, instead of trying to manage all 166, which is a large number, we only have 37 that are either already late or will be late, because we know based on the schedule that they aren't going to make it out on time. Okay, so if I'm a customer service person or a salesperson, I can go in here and just very quickly see, all of my jobs. And the really cool part, tying this all together, is, okay, it was supposed to ship here. Here's when we expect it to actually ship. Okay, so in this particular case, it's not going to go on the 14th, but it's going to go on the 15th. That's a much different conversation to have with a customer than it's late and I don't know when it's going to be late. Okay, and so you can probably start to see in your own organizations how that type of information can be used and is extremely powerful in terms of tying what's physically happening out on the floor and the data that's being generated off those machines, and using that data to drive our own internal processes as it relates to planning, scheduling, but then also the communication of that information back out into the organization. Okay, let me go to this. So we'll just spend a few more minutes wrapping up, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So we talked about planning and scheduling in 3.0. In 4.0, here's some of the opportunities again and where you can try to get to within your own organization. So rather than what we saw in 3.0, what we're talking about now is much more dynamic lead times to customers, much more responsiveness to customers, automatic schedule updates and status updates, reviewing and managing exceptions. So instead of executing the process, you're really managing the process, and you're managing the exceptions that come from that process. Okay, and then if we talk about like a planner and scheduler, one of the examples that I always talk about is, if I'm a planner scheduler and I spend the first 2 hours of my morning simply developing the schedule or developing the plan, very rarely do I have the time to effectively communicate that out to my internal and external stakeholders. Okay, so I may know that a job is going to be late or that a job is going to be on time, but I can't communicate that because I'm simply spending my time just generating schedules all day, every day, or adjusting to those schedules or answering customer questions. So one of the things that, instead of saying, hey, we're not going to have someone do planning and scheduling, that's not really the approach that I would take. I would really take the approach of saying, let that person manage a piece of technology that does 95% of the work for them, so that they can really focus on, one, the 5% of the exceptions, and two, making sure that everyone in the organization is aware of what those results are and what those expectations are, both internally and externally. Okay. And then lastly, what's the benefit statement? Okay, so if all this sounds, it's like, okay, this is great, but you're sitting there thinking, man, it takes a lot of work to do that. You're right. It's not, if it was really easy, everybody would do it, is what I always say. But it is super worth it if you can do it well. Okay. You need to work on things like, your MIS or your ERP. So making sure you're driving data integrity where you can. Really focusing on just capturing data. I'll talk about some of the easy ways to get started. But there are super, super important benefit statements that if you can get it done and get it done right, drives very material improvements to the organization, both from a human perspective in allowing people to work on more value-added activities, but also very tangible financial improvements as well. Okay, so throughput increase. That's a very obvious one. I'm sure all of you can think of times in your organization where, because we lost track of a particular order, we had to do an extra 2-hour changeover that we didn't think we'd have to do. Okay, well, that's a very clear example of, if we could have avoided that 2 hours altogether, we now get 2 hours back on the machine, allows us to increase our throughput across the whole value stream of assets in our shop. Minimization of waste. This should hopefully, again, be a pretty self-explanatory one, but I'll use the HP example that we saw on the schedule there. Just being able to keep 2 tickets or 2 jobs back to back on the same material type or the same exact type of material, all of a sudden you can find yourself running these jobs back to back to back to back. And instead of having 50 feet of waste or 100 feet of waste, you might have 20 or 30 or 40. And again, that adds up over a period of time to be a very meaningful amount of material that you can save and either, be more cost effective to your customers in the marketplace, or simply, expand your margin. It depends on what the objectives are of the business and the state of the business at that point in time. 3 and 4, obviously I hit those a little bit from a human perspective, but one of the reasons we really started working in the batch space around solving this problem is, if you go into many of these manufacturing sites, the planner or scheduler has one of the most difficult jobs. They have cost numbers that they usually need to meet, so you have to hit a certain cost profile of the products you're making, but you also have, frankly, salespeople and customer service reps and customers, screaming at you or bugging you all day with, where's this job needs to go, this job needs to go, etc. Those folks typically have a very difficult lose-lose situation in front of them. And the example I always throw out is, if you had 3 jobs to do today, you needed to get them all 3 done, but you only have time to get 1 done. And job 1 is, it's for your largest customer, but it's not due for 3 days. Job 2 is for a medium-sized customer and it's due today. And job 3 is for a really small customer, but it's already 5 days late. Okay, and you can only pick one. Which one would you choose? Well, and the answer is you would have a very logical reason to do any of those 3 jobs. But no matter which one of those you choose, someone's going to be upset. Okay, the customer may be upset if their job's late again. Salesperson might be upset, or your plant manager might not be that happy because the one that you chose caused a changeover or some amount of downtime. Okay, so utilizing a system to do that for you allows that person to be much more effective at managing the system versus being, in some cases, the scapegoat for every single decision that happens on the shop floor. Okay, and again, depending on your organization, some of these may resonate more than others. Some of you may already know there's a waste problem or a throughput problem, or the team is really beat down because they're just on this hamster wheel all day, every day. But ultimately, it's worth pursuing these types of opportunities in your organization and automating and focusing on these processes, because it drives very, very meaningful improvements back into the business. All right, so how do you start moving towards it? We'll wrap up with this and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So a lot of people you hear, and even today, I'm using some buzzwords here and there, and it can sound very theoretical in nature. It's pie in the sky. It's, so far down the road that it's not worth talking about today. I would encourage you, you don't really need to go and bite off this whole big complicated project all at once. Just like with anything in your business, you can start by working towards it with baby steps. Okay. So first and foremost, just start gathering and organizing as much data as you can. Okay. And an example of that would be if you have a piece of equipment that allows you to collect data off of it, whether that's speeds or set, certain temperature settings or whatever it might be. Just even if you don't have a plan to actively use that data tomorrow, just start gathering it. Just start gathering that data. And so many of these technologies, batched included, utilize historical data to help inform how it makes decisions or how it makes recommendations. So it's kind of like the old investing principle, like the best time to, or the tree principle is a better one. The best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago, and the second best time is today. It's the same principle applies to data, is even if you don't have a plan to actively use it, just start gathering it as much as you can today. Second piece, all of you on the call, most of you on the call would have some type of MIS or ERP system. Okay. Second thing I would do is really focus then on the data, the integrity of the data you are already gathering. Equipment parameters, product parameters, customer parameters. Really focus on the processes that are established within your MIS or your ERP system, and focus on just getting those right. And you're never going to get them 99.99% right. Focus on solving and documenting the processes that drive 80% of your data or 80% of your workflows. And getting those really set up and working really well will set you up for not only planning and scheduling, but all other sorts of opportunities down the road as well.
So Matt, I'm going to interrupt real quick. So having
Sure.
run a label company myself in the past, that number two really becomes very important as to kind of how you set up the constants in your MIS ERP application. No matter what application you're using, if it's something that you've set up yourself or you've bought something else in the market, so often people end up, saying, oh, I'm going to make it this way so I get the numbers that I'm looking for. I get these results that I want. And what ends up happening then when you're looking at doing anything that's automating your process, you're going to get the results that you've put in. So this is the time that you have to be honest with yourself and be able to say, okay, this is the real world that I'm experiencing. Not what I'm dreaming about, not that I want, but this is what my real numbers are. And then if you can go from there, that's when you're really going to start drilling down and getting success with whatever tool that you're going to be using.
Exactly. And again, it's work, and it might be scary to think, hey, if you've already really kind of customized your ERP to death in a certain sense. The good news is a lot of technologies out there can be flexible to that, but ultimately, like any good technology, a lot of cases it's garbage in, garbage out. So what you put into the system is going to in large part dictate what you can get out of it. And again, same type of deal. The best time to start focus on that was 10 years ago. The second best time is today. So pick one area, start small, and just start making progress on it. Number 3, document tribal knowledge. Okay, this is one that we come across all the time where, Jimmy or Jane or whoever it is, there's that one person in every organization who just knows everything about how the shop floor works. They know that, this customer has to go to this machine because we had some adhesive issue 5 years ago. We know that this job has to go to this machine because, this particular color station is super finicky and it works better there, That type of tribal knowledge, I would really encourage you to start. Don't have to do anything fancy with it. Just start putting it down on paper. What types of rules, what types of constraints, what types of limitations exist in your manufacturing environment that don't really live anywhere and may not even have a home in your MIS system to capture that. It's just this knowledge that has accumulated over the years. Because again, a lot of technologies out there can learn over time those types of items, but they become much more effective much more quickly if you can basically tell something like a batched that, hey, this type of product has to go on this machine for this reason. It gets it a much better head start. Plus, from a business practicality perspective, it's very risky to have a set of individuals or a particular individual who has all of that planning and scheduling knowledge in their head. It's much better, much safer if you have that documented. So even in the event that they didn't show up to work one day, you're able to continue with business as normal and not have the fire drill. Fourth, start looking at available tools. So I would do 1 through 3 before you even start looking at software or technology solutions out there. So a lot of folks, to be honest, they'll call us up and they'll say, hey, batch looks really interesting, like let's talk about it. And they haven't even started thinking about 1 through 3 up on the board there. And oftentimes we have to come back to them and say, listen, hey, you should really go focus on this within your business first, or you should focus on this. And again, it's never going to be 100% perfect, but the sooner you can start thinking about and taking some action on 1 through 3, that's really the best thing to do before you even start looking at different technology solutions out there. And once you do that, then you can start looking at technology to start actually leveraging the data and driving those decisions and automating those various processes for you. And again, if you're looking at this and you're just thinking, man, this sounds like a lot of work, the answer is, yeah, it's like anything in your business. It's not going to be no work, but it doesn't also need to be some very time-consuming multi-year project. Depending on the state of your business, a lot of this can be done in a matter of weeks and months, not years. And obviously, the sooner you get started, the sooner you can start to get to the point where you're realizing all of those benefits we talked about on the slide prior. All right. So hopefully, I know I'm running through it pretty quickly, but hopefully everybody could at least follow along, get a feel for some of the opportunities in planning and scheduling, how it fits within the broader industry 4.0 category. Maybe learn a little bit about batched and what we're working on along the way. And appreciate all of your time today. With that, I'll turn it over, Keith. I don't know if we have any questions, but if you have any questions,
we do have some questions.
I'm happy to take them now.
Yeah, so we've got 2 questions that I think are essentially the same. So I'll read the first one and then also read the second one. How does the scheduling software handle today's real problem, which is often we have no idea when the material will show up? And then let me do the next one because I think you can answer them both at the same time.
Sure.
And so with batched or any other product, you plan for raw materials that is on hand. How about material that is expected to be received?
Yeah, great question. So this is front of mind for everybody. I figured we'd get a material related question today. So 2 years ago, we may not have got that question, but today we definitely will. So there's a couple ways. Let me kind of start with the fundamentals, and then we'll jump into how we approach that problem, because there's different ways to approach it. Number one is I really would look at your purchasing processes as a part of the larger organization to start. Meaning, if you used to have 2 days turnarounds on everything, you never really had to plan how you purchase your materials. Okay. Now most people don't have that luxury. So it needs to have more dedicated focus, more dedicated time to it. I would really encourage you to spend time and effort in that area, even outside of the scheduling piece of it, because it's just such a critical function to the business. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like we're going to get back to the 2-day turnaround times anytime soon from what we're seeing, unfortunately. So it's a little bit of a sidebar. When it comes to planning and scheduling in particular, there's a couple different ways we handle it. One is you really need to have a production release process, okay? So someone in the organization who ultimately owns determining whether or not a job is ready for production at that point in time, okay? That includes not only material, but that includes tooling, inks, artwork has been approved, and that's obviously a very collaborative effort. And I would really encourage you to try to measure that and track that in your MIS as much as possible. Not only the material component of it, but also all of those other pre-press activities. I can't tell you, even aside from the material, how often we get the comment from a customer that they went to press on something where the art wasn't actually finally approved, and then they had to rerun it and waste all that material. So I would focus on that. And then specifically to material, we can handle it a couple different ways. One is, if it truly is that variable that you just have no idea when it's going to arrive, leave it in your plan, but don't put it actually on your hard schedule yet, because you don't want to make a commitment to the customer internally or externally on when that's going to be done if you truly don't know. Okay, so it's planned, meaning we have the time reserved against the machine, but we haven't slotted it to say it's going to run at 6:15 on Tuesday, January 28th. Okay, the second piece of that is in most MIS systems, you can record an expected arrival date of the material. Okay, so if you do have a sense for when it's supposed to arrive, what we do from a batch perspective is we'll look up all your purchase order information and then we'll schedule it, but we'll schedule it after the material is expected to arrive. Okay, and then if there's any change on that expected delivery date, as long as that gets back to your MIS in some way, shape, or form, that can again inform your schedule as to when that product or that job can be produced.
Okay, is that it? Okay.
Yep.
So what level of complexity can batch handle when it comes to calculating changeover settings, 4 ink changes versus 2 ink changes, let's see, and a die change, 3 ink changes and substrate change, you know, those types of changeovers all yield different changeovers, not only on their own, but are also dependent on when they are scheduled against.
Yep, absolutely. So the answer is batch specifically can handle any combination therein. So like colors is a good example where if you're going from a 4-color job to a 6-color job, we can actually identify whether, what number of colors are common between those jobs. So, if you, or a 6-color job to 6-color job that has, 4 colors in common, let's say, we can pick up, hey, you only have 4 colors that are different, or that are 2 colors that are different between those. And therefore your changeover time, specifically 2 colors, is X number of minutes or however long that is. And then we'll layer on top of that whatever other changeover considerations there are, whether that's tooling or material, or if you have like an emboss station or a inline sheeter extension at the end, whatever those other characteristics are, we can handle all of that.
Okay. So here's a good question. This is one that I don't know that I've ever seen, and I think it's a really great question. So whether it's batched or another application that they might be looking at, what is the most frequent reason an implementation fails or doesn't yield the intended results?
No, good question. I mean, there's a variety of reasons, right? But I think the one thing that everybody should go in to any technology project eyes wide open on is that no technology ever is a silver bullet. Meaning the technology itself is rarely ever the answer. The technology is an enabler of your people to be more effective in their jobs and to help them, do their jobs better, more efficiently, etc. So in some of the implementations we've had that struggle, or even other technology implementations that I've done in a prior life, it's typically because there's a misalignment of expectations of what it can really do, and that it simply is just going to solve their problems for you. Okay, every piece of technology, for it to really work and to get the value out of it, still requires work, right? And going in eyes wide open, I think, is the best approach there, to make sure that the company that's buying it or implementing the technology is just as committed to the work that's required to do it as the technology provider is to making sure that the technology fits that particular business.
Okay, let me check. Oh, got one more question here. Came in late. How do you handle scheduled dates to deliver but haven't gotten approved from a customer yet?
Yeah, good question. Usually, I mean, that's kind of a business process question, but if you usually what happens is the order comes in, you give them an initial acknowledgement date. Most companies, I would venture to say, typically quote lead times from artwork approval or proof approval. So typically get the order in the system so you can at least get that capacity reserved on the different machines. But I would recommend, and you could see this in batch or a variety of other systems, but that if you're within, you originally told the customer the 17th of February you're going to ship it, and now you're here at the 15th of February and you're still waiting on artwork approval, that's usually a good trigger to recommit to the customer on a new date with a realistic lead time at that point, based on when their approval is going to come in.
Okay. Well, I think that's it. We've just got 6 minutes left, so we're going to give everyone the rest of their hour back. So one of the things that, as we wrap up, I'd like to thank Matt, but whether you use a product like Batched or another product, what I really encourage you to do is take a look at a lot of the things that Matt talked about today as to how you would think about, using these types of tools in your business, because it's not as simple as just buying it and then dropping it in, turning a light switch on and then expecting it to work. So it's a complicated process and you need to give it some time. So again, whether it's this product or other products, that's what I'm hoping you're able to do, is take away, save the link for this, take a look at it and evaluate how you want to go from there. So at that point, I'm just going to go ahead and wrap up. As a reminder, this webinar is recorded and hosted on the TLMI website. I'd like to thank Matt, and then specifically I'd like to thank Kyle and the TLMI team and everyone in attendance today. And I hope all of you have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thanks all. Thanks, Keith.